Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another post-election discussion. This one co-sponsored by the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the KU Law School. I hope that many of you were able to join the discussion yesterday afternoon with Professor Frenita Tolson. Her presentation, The Inevitability of Democracy, compared existing instances of voter suppression with those that had occurred in the past. It was a very interesting talk. Today's presentation will be more open-ended. We put together a panel of experts from the Political Science Department, the Law School, and the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. They will each speak briefly, and then we will open up the floor for questions. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A feature. You can begin submitting questions whenever you like. Dean Brill and I will keep an eye on those questions and will feed those to the panelists once their presentations conclude. So at this point, I will turn it over to Dean Brill to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. So the panelists agreed that we would not spend a great deal of time reviewing their CVs. Rest assured that all are well versed on the issues, and we thank them for agreeing to participate this afternoon. On our panel are Patrick Miller, an associate professor of political science at the University of Kansas, Rick Levy, who is the J.B. Smith Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at the KU School of Law, and Mark Johnson, who is a partner in the Denton Law Firm and founder of the firm's Kansas City office and an adjunct member of the Law School and Journalism School faculties. We thank each of them for being here. Again, we will have short overviews on what the panelists see happening from their perspectives and areas of expertise. So Patrick, let's begin with you.
Well, thank you. And let me start my stopwatch so I know when to stop as well. So I have a few things I want to talk with you all about, and thanks for everyone for coming today. So I'm going to deal really with the more political perhaps angle of this and things that I think were interesting to see in this election. Let me start by talking about one thing that I think we can all be very happy about and that went very well, which is not only the high turnout that we had in this election, but how well the election overall seems to have been administered. Generally, of course, we can nitpick things not going as well in certain areas than others. But I think, for example, there was a lot of concern about mail balloting and how that would go and whether large numbers of ballots would be systematically disqualified and decide the election, or whether we would have super long lines on election day. And I think a lot of that didn't come to fruition. So I think we can generally be pleased. Of course, we can always do things better as a democracy with how things worked on that front. Here in Kansas, that process seemed to work very well. But of course, we can look at voter access issues in places like Shawnee County, which really limited early voting locations, or Wyandotte County, where election officials really didn't plan very well for ballot drop boxes. Again, always things that we can think about making more equitable or addressing. But I think that's something that worked out pretty well. And that I also hope illustrates for people that high turnout elections don't necessarily have partisan consequences, in the sense that they don't necessarily benefit one party or another, though they can. We did have what appears to be pretty record turnout in most states, and I think that's a good thing compared to some of the downward trends in turnout that we've seen in recent election cycles. Moving on, again, interesting things from my perspective, voters in this election. I don't think there was too much that was surprising. The realignments that we've seen happening in the electorate continued to realign. I think one of the things that we often miss about our parties, which are always changing underneath our feet, is that really for the last 20 years, the Republican Party has been becoming more of a party of the white working class, particularly whites without college degrees, who often tend to be lower on the income spectrum. And the Democratic Party is becoming more of the party of the professional class of whites with college degrees, often higher income, though that income divide is lagging the education divide. we see that quite dramatically in elections since 2016. Fun fact, Joe Biden won white men with college degrees, but he lost white women with college degrees, which is a reversal of 4 years ago, where Hillary Clinton won white women with college degrees, but lost white men. Biden had some marginal improvement among whites without college degrees, but that is really becoming a defining characteristic of our two parties today that is shaping our electoral map in ways we can talk about later if you're interested. I think one thing I'll be watching is getting full and better data on what happened with minority voters in this election. I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump made some marginal but important improvements with Latino and Asian voters. More evident on the ground than necessarily the exit polls. I mean, you can't look at some of the precincts in Florida that are Cuban heavy, or some of the Mexican American precincts in the Rio Grande Valley or California and not see that swing to Trump. I think political scientists were having some conversations right now about what do we think is behind that. And I think some of the initial suspicion is some of the social unrest and policing issues, particularly with regard to African Americans, where some of those sentiments about race perhaps are a little more antagonistic than we think they are, particularly amongst Asian and Latino Americans towards African Americans. But there'll be a lot there to look at as those voters change and realign. And I would also say, just kind of mindful of my time as a parting point, beware of hot takes on polling right now. And I think we need to separate actual error in polling, which is still being assessed, no one has a final decision, versus imagined errors in polling, because we often don't consume polling correctly and we expect too much out of it. You know, if you're looking at polling and you're ignoring the margin of error, you're making a mistake. If you're thinking that an undecided voter is a toss-up voter, that's not correct. If you're thinking that polling is going to predict election outcomes for you, that's not correct either. So I hope that as we go forward and really understand what did happen with polling and what was good and what was bad, that as citizens in the media, we can become smarter consumers of that. The end.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I suspect we may have some follow-up questions on some of those things that you shared with us. Now let's turn to Rick and for his thoughts about this.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you, Stephen, as well as Patrick. There's a lot of constitutional ground that I could cover, but I think the most important constitutional ground relates to the operation of the Electoral College and how that figures in to this 2020 election. So I'm assuming that most of you in the audience are fully aware that we don't actually directly elect the president through a popular vote, but rather we operate through the Electoral College. And the operation of the Electoral College really determines some of the distinctive features of our political system. One bug that I think a lot of people are well aware of is that the Electoral College is disproportionately representational of states with small populations. That's how George W. Bush won the election in 2000, even though Al Gore won the popular vote. That's how Donald Trump won in 2016, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. And it's why this election was a nail biter, even though it was clear all along that Joe Biden would win the popular vote by a relatively substantial margin. So the Electoral College is critical to the selection of the president. The Constitution provides that each state shall appoint its electors in the manner that the legislature of the state directs. So every state has laws that provide for the selection or appointment of electors. When you vote for a president, that's effectively voting for a slate of electors chosen to represent that candidate under the laws of the state. And of course, almost every state provides for a winner-take-all election, except Nebraska and Maine, which is also part of what makes the fallout of the Electoral College so dramatic. Many of you will be aware that there has been a lot of litigation surrounding pandemic-related changes to voting requirements that were established by state legislatures. Early on in the pandemic, A lot of federal courts ordered adjustments to the voting rules, particularly in the primaries, in order to accommodate the pandemic. Those lower federal court decisions were largely rejected and stayed by federal appellate courts and the Supreme Court on the ground that the federal courts were interfering with the state's prerogative to manage their own elections, and because last-minute changes to voting rules would only confuse the voters. More recently, some of the litigation has focused on state court decisions or decisions of state election officials that relaxed or altered statutory rules in order to accommodate difficulties surrounding the pandemic. Some of you may have heard, for example, of the litigation in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Republican Party versus Bostock case, which addressed the decision of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to allow mail ballots that arrived after the election within 3 days to be counted, even though the statute in the state requires those mail ballots to be received by election day. The Supreme Court declined to grant a stay of that order, but there were dissenting opinions, or a dissenting opinion by Justice Alito, joined by Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, in which they indicated their views that this order by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was invalid under the Constitution because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was a court and not the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania. Justice Kavanaugh would have granted the stay. He offered no opinion as to why. The court was evenly divided by a 4-4 split, and so the stay was denied. Now, Chief Justice Roberts indicated in other opinions dealing with court orders surrounding elections that he sees a major difference between federal courts intervening in state electoral provisions and state Supreme Courts making their own decisions on behalf of the state. So it's unclear where he stands on the merits of the Pennsylvania case. It's also unclear whether newly appointed Justice Barrett would participate in the merits of the Pennsylvania case, but it's important to recognize that that case is still alive, and one possible outcome would be that the Supreme Court decides that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's order allowing those late arriving ballots to be counted was invalid. At this point, though, it doesn't appear that that's going to make much of a difference in the outcome in Pennsylvania or in the outcome of the general election. And so the decision or the case ultimately may be moot. At this point, assuming that all the ballots are successfully counted and the results are certified, there is a statutory process through which the results of the electoral vote is recorded, transmitted to Congress, and then accepted. So for those of you that are real nerds on this, the Electoral College delegates will meet on December 14th under 3 USC Section 7. If the results of the state's electoral processes are certified by 6 days before that date, which is December 8th, then the state falls within what's called the safe harbor under the statute, and there is an automatic acceptance of the certification of those results. Now, a final point that I might make is that electors are generally expected to vote in accordance with the results of the popular election. After all, they were selected by the party and the candidate for whom they're committed. Some states have statutory provisions penalizing electors who fail to follow through, but ultimately it's possible that in at least some states and some electors will not vote in accordance with the results of their election. If the outcome of the Electoral College is very close, then it's possible that that could produce a tie or a result in which neither candidate receives 270 votes. If that happens, the election would go to the House of Representatives. If it goes to the House of Representatives, that might seem to favor Biden, but it turns out that the House of Representatives delegations will vote state by state. And at present, the Republican Party controls more than half of the state delegations, so that if it goes to the House of Representatives, we might imagine that the delegations will vote in favor of President Trump. So I don't think at the present it looks like that's going to be an issue, but in any event, if these problems do arise, at least you'll know what the rules are. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. That was a great overview. So our final introduction and overview is with Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Ann. Let me make one point to follow on to what Rick said. If you want to watch an interesting telecast, watch the actual delivery of the electoral votes, which takes place in a joint meeting of the House and the Senate in the House of Representatives, presided over by the President of the Senate, in other words, the Vice President. So if Biden wins, Vice President Pence will have to preside over that meeting. It always makes for interesting watching. But I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what you are going to be seeing happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Right now, all of the returns that you've been, I'm sure, following very closely are completely unofficial. Nothing has been certified. That process will begin next week in every single state. And as Rick implied to you, but one thing I'll make clear is that under our system, the states operate the electoral process. They're in charge of the electoral process, and that includes counting the votes. Starting next week, in every state, in every county, in every state, the county election officials will meet to undertake what's called the canvassing process. That's where they look at all the ballots, all the tabulations to date, add it up, determine whether they should be made official. And then they also look at other ballots, provisional ballots, for example. Those are ballots cast by people who showed up to vote, and for some reason, it didn't appear that they were properly registered. Or, as happened quite frequently this year, people who asked for mail-in ballots got nervous about the process and decided to show up at the polls on election day and vote. Obviously, you can't vote twice. And so in the canvassing process, the decision will be made whether to count the ballot that was voted on election day, or if in fact a mail-in ballot was received before that from that voter, whether that ballot will be counted. There will also be ballots received from members of the military and Americans living overseas. Under federal law, those ballots have to be received, not mailed, but have to be received within 7 days of the election day. So in fact, ballots are coming in as we speak from people in the Army and the Navy and so forth, and also Americans living overseas. And if they're received by next Tuesday, they have to be counted in the official canvassing process. Once that process is concluded, and in Kansas, that has to be finished by a week from Monday, the counties then certify the election results to each state's Secretary of State. So our Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, his office will receive those official counts from the counties, add them up, and then we will have official counts from the states. Only at that point can the recount process begin, if indeed it will begin. And it looks like, for example, the vote in Georgia is going to be close enough that there will be a mandatory recount. In most states, if the election is within 1%, if the result is within 1%, then there's a mandatory recount. And that consists really of nothing more than running the ballots through the counting machines again. The ballots are not examined. So we're not going to see a process like we saw in Florida in 2000. But they run the ballots through the tabulating machines again, and just to check whether the initial count was correct. It is nearly inconceivable to think that in any of the states where there might be a recount, that recount will result in a change in the election. You know, typically, if you see 1 million ballots cast, you might see a recount that changes the tabulations by 5 or 10 or 15 votes. The counting process that we have in place in the United States now is remarkably accurate, but it's always possible. So that's the recount process. The other process that we might see that, for example, the Trump administration has been talking about is cheating. Fraud in the actual election process itself. That would result in another type of examination that's called an election contest. And in that, it's an adversarial proceeding. One side presents evidence of cheating, if you will, and the other side, and usually, you know, it's the side that won the election, will rebut that. The contest process varies very much from state to state. The courts do have a role in that process. Sometimes the legislatures have a role in that process. It just depends on what the state law is. But once that is completed, then and if there's any change in the result, that may change the which side gets the electors' votes. But we have a procedure under federal law that Rick just talked to you about that requires the Electoral College to meet and cast their votes by December. And so that's why there's a possibility that the Supreme Court may become involved, as it did in 2000, to decide whether a recount process or a contest process can continue, because it's possible that it may take so long that it extends beyond the safe harbor deadlines that are specified in the federal statutes. But those are the kinds of things you're going to be reading and hearing about in the next 2 or 3 weeks. At this point, possibly from several states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, maybe others. We'll just have to see. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to be experiencing in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And now I think it's time for questions.
Sounds great. Thank you all. We've been getting some questions through the Q&A feature. So if you have others, please go ahead and type those in. Rick, I'm going to start with you, although others may want to weigh in on this. We have a question from one of our listeners. If you were going to articulate the single strongest argument for preserving the Electoral College rather than moving to a popular vote system, what would that argument be?
Okay, so first of all, the single strongest argument might be it's impossible to alter the Electoral College because that requires a constitutional amendment, and there's no way that the necessary supermajority of states will ratify that, because a lot of small states who benefit from the Electoral College would vote against it. So with that in mind, I'm going to put that to one side. That's not really an argument. That's just a reality check. I think the best argument for retaining the Electoral College is that we retain a federal system in which states have a function not merely as an aggregation of individual persons, but as political entities within a structure that recognizes their role as dual sovereigns with an important residual authority under the Constitution, that eliminating the Electoral College would allow the very populous states to essentially override any sort of real role in governance by those less populous states, and make the significance of their status as states diminish. That's at least from my perspective, the most powerful argument on the merits.
Others want to weigh in? Patrick?
I don't know if this is so much a rationale. I think I would have seen this as a rationale for keeping it more a decade ago, but I've kind of been evolving in my thinking to the point where I'm beginning to see political parties in America as a threat to many aspects of our democracy. But I think people should remember that the reason we have a two-party system in the US is that we have an electoral system that creates incentives for two large coalitions. Winner-take-all elections encourage people to make coalitions rather than to factionalize. So the Electoral College, or the way that we elect House or Senate members, really creates the two parties. And if you begin to change that system into something like maybe a proportional representation system or a popular vote with a runoff for president, then you create an incentive for actually more factionalization than we have now. So imagine instead of two main presidential candidates, you have something like France could have with half a dozen main presidential candidates. Generally, without polarized parties, a system like ours is often better at marginalizing extremes. I think we're beginning to fail with that. The alternative system has no promises against extremes either, as if you follow French politics, I mean, how the National Front made it into a presidential runoff not that long ago. So I think if you want to break political parties apart, which could be good, change the electoral system, but also realize you can also empower a very small group of well-mobilized people with that alternative.
Oh, well, I think the only point that I would make is that, I mean, there is actually a model statute that's floating around that's been adopted by a number of states that in essence, if the state adopts it, would say that whichever candidate receives the majority of the national popular vote gets that state's electoral vote. And I think now maybe 15 or 20 states have adopted that. I think Colorado just did recently. The problem with that, I think, is that elections, it wouldn't really change how campaigns work. I think that you'd see campaigns focusing on where the populations are. They'd go to California, they'd go to New York, they'd go to Philadelphia, Chicago, try to run up the margins there, and folks who live where we live would continue to be ignored. I mean, as I've told my students many times, the only way that a presidential candidate is going to come to Kansas or Missouri is if their plane runs out of fuel. I mean, they simply don't come here because they know where our electoral college votes are going to go. And I don't think that would change with somehow changing the electoral system. So whoever wins the popular vote wins the presidency.
So we have a couple questions about political sociology. And Patrick, you might want to respond to this first. In the sense that we tend to put voters into groups, i.e. white men, white women, college educated, how is this helpful and not helpful? And why do you think some of those groups, as we've sort of put them together, switched this year?
Well, I mean, there's a long tradition of looking at voters in groups. I mean, demographics are simple for us to understand. We think they can tell compelling stories. Although I think over time, as social scientists in particular, we've come to appreciate how there can be a lot of psychological diversity within groups in terms of prioritizing different things. And demographics can cut certain ways. College educated whites veering off in a different political direction from whites without college degrees, for example. We often do underestimate in that what the really important political divides are. There's a lot of attention on the gender gap, but the gender gap is actually much smaller than the education gap in politics today, particularly among whites. So I think we're often not looking at the right things. In terms of groups that are transitioning, you know, the parties are always transitioning. Our political coalitions are always transitioning. I think we're used to knowing that like evangelical whites have become more Republican, but Latinos and Asians have become more Democratic. Of course, none of that is monolithic, and those changes are gradual, but that doesn't mean that there isn't diversity of opinion and diversity of behavior within those groups. And I think that it is more useful to think of voters as a group or a block in some cases. African Americans, for example, very cohesive in their political behavior in terms of voting, even if on issues there's a lot more division. But Latinos as a group have a lot more diversity, for example. So I think it helps to really know what's going on internally with any one group that you want to talk about.
Rick or Mark?
Well, I would just add that the tendency to think about voters as group-related blocks creates an intersection between politics and race, politics and gender or sex, maybe politics and religion, that creates distinctive constitutional problems, particularly on issues like gerrymandering, where the overlap between racial and political gerrymandering is often problematic. And so it also then tends to create policies that are designed to appeal to groups based on race or sex or other characteristics, rather than thinking about the polity as a whole in trying to devise sound policies. So I tend to think that the propensity to view groups as cohesive voting blocks is a detriment to the overall political process and the quality of policy choices.
I'll tell you, Rick, I don't disagree with you on that, but I've been involved in, oh goodness, 2 or 3 dozen political campaigns. And I can tell you that talking about people in groups is easy. We're not talking about we're not going after 100% of a group's vote. We're going after 50% plus 1. And so it's easy to talk about people in groups, what their tendencies might be, because that tends to be the way that successful politicians look at it. And as you know, a successful politician is someone who wins elections. And you know, we don't want 100%. I mean, even today, a 10% margin is viewed as a landslide, is viewed as a convincing win. That's what candidates are looking for.
Oh, I'm not saying that it's unwise from a political perspective to target groups. I'm saying it's unfortunate that the political advantages of thinking about groups results in distorted political agendas and policy choices.
I
So
would
Mark,
just counter back. We're not going to eliminate identity politics. It has always existed, and it exists for everyone. Identity politics exists as much for whites as it does African Americans or any other group. Different groups experience our democracy in different ways, and that means they have different interests and different ways that they think about their place in our democracy. So I think I really don't accept the notion anymore. I mean, I've looked at enough public opinion polling of Americans to disabuse myself of the notion that we are all on the same page about what we want for policy, or what our democracy should even look like, or how it should function. And groups oftentimes become the way that that gets expressed in politics. So I would just kind of push back on the underlying assumption that there is some kind of greater agenda or greater consensus out there that we probably should be thinking about, because I'm not sure it exists.
I guess I just feel like the groups that we go to are too facile and easily identified. There are more complex interplays of interests.
Sure.
But I think we should move on to another set of questions, as much fun as this conversation is.
Well, I have one for Mark. What reasons, if any, would there be for either presidential campaign to pursue litigation if it becomes clear that the number of votes in question would not change the outcome of the election? And how would you anticipate courts responding to that sort of litigation?
Actually, most of the states have statutes that require that the number of votes at stake could potentially be dispositive. They're not out to get embroiled in disputes where the result is not going to change anything. It certainly makes sense, and the courts are always reluctant to expend their resources on disputes that aren't going to go anywhere. So, yeah, I mean, that's why, for example, if let's say the margin in Michigan, which is well over 100,000 votes right now, even if the Republicans are very unhappy with that, nothing's going to, any kind of litigation is simply not going to go anywhere because the number of votes that could possibly be contested there aren't going to make a difference in the outcome. That's why Georgia may be a state that they're really going to go after, maybe Pennsylvania, depending on what the margin ends up being.
Well, how would you anticipate a court along the same lines responding to a broad claim of fraud where it would be difficult to identify a particular group of votes because the claim of misconduct is so broad?
The court, well, if the trial judge is doing what he or she is supposed to, the first thing they'll say is, what's your evidence? Give me the evidence, make sure it's admissible evidence, and then maybe we'll, maybe we'll go to a hearing. The point of it is that you have to prove the claim. I mean, up to now, we've been hearing allegations. And I have to say the media has been doing its job at all ends of the spectrum by simply saying, okay, now it's up to the people who have, who are making these allegations to come forward with evidence.
So for all of our panelists, whoever wants to start first, big question. Win or lose, how has Donald J. Trump changed politics? I see eyes rolling and heads shaking. Rick.
Okay, you guys go first.
Oh, well, Rick was going to go.
Well, I'm happy to defer on this question too. I will add something after you're done.
I'll jump in. He's changed politics in a basic way. You don't have to be a politician before you run for president. He's the first president ever elected who had never even run, much less held political office before becoming president. To that extent, he has made this idea that, I mean, when you think of Ross Perot in the 1990s and other candidates like that, he's made it possible for someone like that to really be taken seriously.
How about Dwight Eisenhower also did not have elected office before becoming president. So I think there might be two.
All right, I stand corrected.
General, Commander Allied Forces.
He has been a president before, although president of Columbia University.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll give my 2 cents. I think Donald Trump has, people often ask, is Donald Trump a cause or a symptom? And I think Donald Trump is a symptom rather than a cause of changes in politics. I think, I spent a lot of time thinking about voters and groups. And I think, for example, one of the biggest changes, again, we've seen in the last 20 years, and also thinking about where Donald Trump's strength is in the electorate. One of the biggest changes we've seen is the death of the New Deal coalition. We're used to thinking about Democrats as a party of working class whites and minorities, and Republicans are the country club party, but that's all changing. Democrats are becoming the country club party and minorities, and Republicans are becoming the party of the Union Hall. And the evidence is that is being driven by cultural and racial issues and not economics. And I think there are a lot of liberals who have convinced themselves that if only they can offer the right policy agenda on, democratic socialism or whatever you want to call it, that those voters will come back to them. And I think that's a fallacy. I mean, it's a good illustration. Working class whites in rural communities that are the hardest hit by hospital closures are the most likely to vote against Medicaid expansion ballot initiatives. What you think should be their economic self-interest is not necessarily what's driving that behavior. And I think Donald Trump accelerated that trend. He really brought light, not just on what the divisions and the priorities in the electorate are, but showing that you can act differently than a normal politician and not be punished by voters.
Yeah, that was actually what I was going to speak to. So I think that he has changed the way in which politicians are likely to react to what are seen as gaffes, mistakes, misstatements that are offensive and the like going forward. I think before Donald Trump, the conventional wisdom was you apologize, maybe you issue an apology that's not really an apology, but you hope to minimize damage by expressions of contrition and I won't do it again. And what Donald Trump succeeded in doing is a strategy of doubling down and refusing to apologize. And I'm not sure that other politicians will be as successful as he will, but I think you'd start to see more and more politicians take that perspective that I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to amp up my my rhetoric on this issue, and I think that's likely to be a fairly long-term change in our political discourse.
So that was sort of a broad question. I'm going to go to a narrower one. Mark, sort of a law school hypothetical. We got a question from someone who requested an absentee ballot. The ballot did not arrive. This person began to get nervous, so she went and voted in person on Saturday before the election, and she wants to know what is the status of her vote. Is that a provisional ballot?
That is the best example of a provisional ballot. I can tell you right now that in Johnson County, there are 13,000 provisional ballots. I would bet that 90% of them fall into that category. Don't worry, her vote will be counted. That provisional ballot will be counted. And
can she expect to be contacted, or they'll just check her name against the address or?
Well, what they do is they write down on the outside of ballot a code that says, okay, this is why this is a provisional ballot. And then they will talk about all of those types at once, and they'll say, okay, there, count them. So unless there's another problem with it, she won't hear anything.
It's probably reassuring to her. Thanks, Mark. So question for Rick. Can you briefly address the logistics of court packing under a hypothetical scenario where an administration chooses to pursue that?
So first of all, I would observe that we have already watched court packing in action in at least one method, which is to carefully block any appointees by a president whose politics are different from yours, and to rush in and confirm as quickly as possible any nominees of your own president. So it may be legitimate constitutionally, but it is nonetheless, it seems to me, a clear example of court packing. Now, I think when people think court packing going forward, what they're thinking about is the expansion of the number of members on the court, so that a particular president with the support of a majority in the Senate would be able to replace, or excuse me, add a number of justices that would alter the balance of the court. That was proposed by President Roosevelt back in the 1930s. He proposed that 6 new positions be added to the court, which would have allowed him to appoint a large number of justices and alter the majority so that it would be more receptive to his New Deal programs. I don't know whether if there were support for an expanded court, I don't know whether you need 6, but it would take enough to sort of alter the balance, and you would have to be able to count on filling those positions, which I think, given what we know about the current makeup of the Senate, it seems unlikely that there would be support for statutory changes to expand the court. You don't need a constitutional amendment for that, or for the appointment of enough justices to fill the court and shift its balance.
Mark, Patrick, care to weigh in?
Well, I mean, Rick is absolutely right. There's no constitutional amendment that would be required. I mean, the court started with 5 in the 1790s, and it became as large as 11 in the post-Civil War years. So the size has gone up and down. It seems that 9 is for all of us the traditional number. I think what happened in the 1930s is an indicator of what I think would happen here. That Roosevelt, even with super majorities, particularly in the Senate, he couldn't get the proposal out of the Senate. I think it would die.
It's not going anywhere because so many Democrats, even a lot of progressive Democrats, have already said no to the idea. I think it's gained a lot of airtime, but it's not going to happen.
Patrick, I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier that a majority of educated female voters voted for the Republican Party. Why do you think that happened? And what do you think that changed compared with the last election?
Well, it wasn't a big change. Overall, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton had a small win, but it was a win among white women with college degrees. That reversed in this election. Donald Trump had a small win with white women with college degrees. And actually the movement among white men with college degrees was much larger, and they narrowly went for Biden. That education divide is becoming larger. And come back to it's the inverse of the realignment actually that we see with more working class whites. That education gap is, we suspect, forming over perceptions of cultural change, racial change, rather than necessarily income or economic interests. So it's very much the same thing driving that division, just different ends of it. Whites with college degrees, though, started from a quite Republican place. So their drift towards the Democratic Party, it's not as great as whites without college degrees and how much they've drifted towards the Republicans. But they were starting from a very red place in their voting. So to even be now where they're, pretty narrowly divided is a substantial improvement for Democrats.
So another interesting perspective and, observation, I guess, is that, we saw in 2016, a lot of media outlets calling various states, calling the election rather early. Hillary Clinton says now she should not have conceded when she did. But what do you attribute what seems to be a change this year with the aberration of Fox calling Arizona, 72 or more hours ago, but nobody else has called that. So what do you think is going on with the media's role in reporting on the election results?
Well, personally, I am glad that really since the 2000 election, I think overall the media has become much more cautious about this. If we think about the 2000 election, first calling Florida for Gore, pulling it back, calling it for Bush, pulling it back. Part of the problem was, exit polls in that case, but also part of the problem was how the media chose to act. I mean, the exit poll indicated there wasn't a clear winner, but the media went ahead and just called a winner anyway. There was, I think, more of a rush to be that first person to make that call back then. I think with the crow that they ate over that, we've generally seen more caution, which I think is a good thing. There's been some criticism that they've been too cautious. one of the things we see is a state like Alabama, which you expect to go Republican, may close, but the media may say too early to call because they want to wait for some of those numbers to come in just to make sure that what you expected is actually what you're seeing. So I think that's a good thing. And I would actually praise the media on how it's evolved on all this. I get why Fox called Arizona. I think it was too early to do it. There were so many ballots left out, and I think they expected them to be much more democratic than they turned out to be. I wouldn't have done it if I was running their network, but I'm not.
Yeah, well, I think maybe until today, they were pretty nervous about having made that call. It turns out it's probably going to be a right call, but boy, I bet you for 36 hours, there were a lot of people within Fox saying, why did we do that?
I would just add that part of the reason why there may be delay in calling is that this year, at least some of the states are so incredibly close, and that there are batches of ballots, the counting of which was greatly delayed. And as a consequence, and ballots that tilted decidedly one way or another and could swing the outcome, but that it's been very difficult to predict how, whether they're like in Pennsylvania, it took a long time before you could say with any certainty that there were enough pro-Biden ballots yet to be counted that he would overtake President Trump.
The problem with Pennsylvania was a provision of the state law that forbade them from starting to count the mail-in ballots until the polls closed on election day.
And I'm not.
Yeah, most of the states allowed mail-in ballots to be counted before. So that's why Pennsylvania is, quote, slow.
But my point generally is we still have states that are still counting where it's very close, and it makes sense under those circumstances for the networks and the media to say, well, we're not going to call these elections because there are in fact too close to call.
Right. Nobody should be calling Georgia anytime soon, but Wisconsin, sure, the size of that lead, and what could credibly change there with recounts and ballots and such.
Yeah.
So Rick, assuming that Joe Biden gets enough votes in the Electoral College, what happens if President Trump just refuses to concede? What goes down at that point?
Well, I think he can refuse to concede, but the reality would be that the Congress would certify the results of the Electoral College, and unless there's a large number of Republicans who are willing to fall on the sword to sort of defy the results of the Electoral College, and they are joined by Democrats, the ultimate outcome is that Biden will be declared the winner. If President Trump then refuses to concede the office, I suppose it might be necessary for the Secret Service and the military to physically remove him from the White House. But I think his ability to continue to act as president depends upon the other institutions of government accepting that. And I don't think that's likely to happen. So
Patrick, politically, what would that mean if President Trump were not to be declared the winner and he were to continue to contest the election, after January?
Well, I mean, first on the concession point, concessions are tradition, they're not required. I mean, they're a good thing for our political culture and helping to build legitimacy. I think there are many ways in which our democracy is being illegitimized by both political parties, and I would hate to see another chink in that armor with the lack of a concession. That would not be a healthy thing for how I think we approach and think about our democracy. I agree with the point before that Donald Trump, I mean, worst case scenario, he refuses to give up office. It really requires the rest of the government going along with that. And I think just look at what you're seeing politically in the last 24 hours with Republicans not enthusiastic, most of them, with jumping on board these voter fraud claims. Some of them for the first time in the last 4 years now openly chastising the president about his talk on that. And politically, I think there are a lot of Republicans who see a brighter future for their party without him in many ways, maybe for their own ambitions as well. So I don't think that there will be a collective desire on the part of Republicans who do have to maintain their brand to necessarily line up behind anything that he may do. Those institutional concerns and their own political concerns, I think, may take precedence over his desire to continue to fight.
Yeah, I mean, by operation of law, noon on January 20th, that's it. You know, the king is dead, long live the king. That's what'll happen if he continues to, if he doesn't leave voluntarily.
So I'm curious, from each of you, when do you think that this election will be called? One way or the other?
Today.
By who?
Well, probably today, tomorrow, but that's very different from resolved.
I mean, called, if by what you mean called, the network saying that it looks like he's going to have, I mean, one of the ironies is that in all probability, it looks like Biden's going to say, will wind up with the same number of electoral college votes that Trump did. Trump got 306. But if Pennsylvania becomes beyond reach, he's over 270, that's it. And that appears to be happening today.
We've got time, I believe, for one more question. We got a follow-up about recounts. When a state goes to do a recount, do they do it for all of the elections that occurred, or do you do it just, can you request that it's just for the presidential election, just for the election?
Yes.
And what if it wouldn't make any difference? Because someone, it's, from a state that has a very low number of electoral college members, so it doesn't really matter which way they come out. Are they still going to do the recount?
Yeah, a state's going to do it. The state parties are very interested in being able to say, our candidate won our state, even if it didn't make a difference in the overall electoral college. Yeah, I mean, the states are going to go through the recount process if the margin falls within the amount allowed for a recount. It's got to be very close. I mean, you're not going to see a recount just because somebody asks for one in Oklahoma.
Well, we promised everyone that we were going to keep today's session to an hour. Really appreciate our wonderful panelists who took time out of their busy schedules to be with us. If you're viewing this presentation live, I suspect that you're still somewhat anxious about the results of the election, regardless of who you voted for. Be patient, allow the system to operate as it's supposed to operate, and maybe this weekend get some sleep, because I suspect that many of you have had some sleepless nights during the past several days. So thanks again. Thanks to Ann and her folks over at Journalism. Appreciate y'all co-sponsoring with us. Thanks again to all of our panelists. And all right, everybody have a good one. Thanks.
Take care.